No one spoke when it happened. Not the guests seated beneath the crystal chandelier. Not the waiters standing along the polished walls. Not even the musicians who had been playing softly in the corner just seconds earlier. The room simply froze, as if the air itself had decided to stop moving. At the center of that silence stood a young maid named Emily Carter, her hands trembling as she held a silver tray that suddenly felt far heavier than it should have. Across from her stood the host of the evening, Jonathan Caldwell, a man whose name carried weight in business circles from New York to Los Angeles. Caldwell had built an empire in finance and real estate, the kind of empire that allowed him to purchase a mansion overlooking the Hudson River and fill it with powerful guests who laughed at his stories and admired the life he displayed so proudly. Several guests exchanged glances. A few of them had known Caldwell for years and had seen flashes of this side of him before. Because the truth was that the scene taking place that evening was not the beginning of the story. It was the moment everything finally surfaced. For Jonathan Caldwell, the mansion represented success, a place where he could entertain investors, celebrate business victories, and demonstrate the life his fortune had created. The estate itself covered several acres overlooking the river, surrounded by tall iron gates and manicured gardens that had been designed to impress anyone who arrived at its entrance. Inside, the house was even more extravagant. Marble floors stretched through hallways lined with paintings and sculptures collected from auctions around the world. The dining hall where the confrontation was unfolding could easily seat 30 guests beneath a chandelier imported from Italy, its crystal pieces reflecting warm light across the polished table. Every detail of the property had been carefully chosen to send a clear message. Jonathan Caldwell had built something powerful. Yet beneath the polished surfaces and elegant gatherings, the mansion also held a different reality. It was a place where employees worked long hours maintaining an environment designed to appear flawless. Drivers, cooks, cleaners, and house managers moved through the property in quiet coordination, making sure every event Caldwell hosted unfolded smoothly. Most guests rarely considered how many people were required to maintain that illusion of effortless luxury. For them, the mansion existed simply as a backdrop for conversations, deals, and celebrations. But for the staff who spent their days and nights there, the house had its own rhythm and its own unspoken rules. They understood which hallways Caldwell preferred to walk through when he was thinking, which rooms he used for private meetings, and which moments were safest to avoid his attention entirely. Emily Carter had learned those rhythms quickly after arriving. She had studied the routines of the kitchen, the schedule of deliveries, and the careful choreography required to serve guests without disrupting the flow of an evening like the one now unfolding in the dining hall. What no one around her realized was that Emily had also been paying attention to something else entirely. Every conversation she overheard, every name mentioned during Caldwell's gatherings, every subtle exchange between powerful people seated at his table had quietly formed a picture in her mind. She was not simply observing the behavior of wealthy guests enjoying an extravagant dinner. She was witnessing connections, alliances, and tensions that stretched far beyond the walls of that mansion. And on this particular night, when Jonathan Caldwell chose to single her out in front of everyone, those hidden observations would soon become part of a much larger story. For now, however, the focus of the room remained fixed on the stranger who had stepped forward. His appearance had interrupted a moment Caldwell clearly expected to control completely. Guests leaned slightly in their chairs, watching with renewed interest as the quiet balance of power in the room began to shift in subtle ways. Caldwell, a man used to commanding attention, suddenly found himself studying someone whose presence he could not immediately explain. The maid he had intended to dismiss stood only inches away from the stranger, still silent, her eyes lowered, as if she were waiting for something that had not yet been revealed. In the hours and days that followed, people who attended that dinner would replay the moment again and again in their minds. They would remember the tension in the room, the way conversations stopped, the way Caldwell's confidence wavered for the first time that evening. But in that exact instant, standing beneath the chandelier with dozens of curious eyes watching, none of them could yet understand how significant the interruption truly was. Because the stranger who had stepped forward was not acting on impulse, and the quiet maid standing beside him was not as powerless as she appeared. The mansion, with all its wealth and authority, was about to become the stage for a revelation that would reach far beyond that dining table. Jonathan Caldwell had spent more than 2 decades building the kind of reputation that made people listen carefully whenever he spoke. In the financial world, his name carried a certain gravity, the kind that opened doors before he even entered a room. Newspapers often described him as disciplined, strategic, and relentless. His companies had developed luxury properties across several American cities, and his investment firm had quietly acquired stakes in businesses ranging from shipping logistics to private aviation. For many people watching from the outside, Jonathan Caldwell represented the ideal story of success. A man who had started from modest beginnings and turned ambition into a fortune large enough to reshape skylines and influence entire industries. Yet for those who worked closely around him, the story felt more complicated. Caldwell believed deeply in control, and the environment inside his mansion reflected that belief in ways guests rarely noticed. Employees moved through the house with careful precision, aware that Caldwell's mood could shift quickly depending on the smallest detail. A misplaced glass, a delayed delivery, or an unexpected interruption during a meeting could draw his attention in ways that left staff members wishing they had remained invisible. Over time, the people who worked in the mansion developed quiet strategies for avoiding that attention altogether. Conversations among the staff were short and practical, usually whispered near service hallways or kitchen counters where guests could not hear them. Even the house manager, a woman who had worked in private estates for years, had learned that the safest approach when dealing with Jonathan Caldwell was to anticipate his expectations before he needed to voice them. To outsiders, the mansion functioned like a perfectly managed environment of luxury and elegance. But within its walls, there was also a constant awareness that the man who owned everything inside it demanded absolute order. Former employees would later explain that Caldwell's approach to leadership extended far beyond business decisions. He believed strongly in hierarchy, and he made sure everyone around him understood where they stood within it. Investors and partners received charm and attention during formal meetings, while politicians and high-profile guests enjoyed the hospitality of his elaborate events. But the people responsible for maintaining the daily rhythm of his life often experienced a different side of him. Several former staff members described moments when Caldwell had chosen to correct someone publicly rather than privately, turning small mistakes into examples meant to reinforce authority. One former driver remembered a situation when Caldwell criticized him sharply in front of visiting colleagues for arriving 2 minutes later than expected. Another recalled how a catering assistant was dismissed during a holiday gathering simply for placing the wrong wine near a guest's seat. To Caldwell, these moments were practical reminders of discipline. To the employees involved, they felt more like performances staged for the benefit of anyone watching. Those stories rarely reached the guests who attended Caldwell's parties or the journalists who wrote about his professional achievements. In public, he remained composed and confident, a businessman who understood negotiation and influence better than most. He donated to charitable foundations, appeared at fundraising events, and spoke occasionally about the importance of opportunity in American business culture. The contrast between that public image and the private environment within his mansion created a strange dynamic. People who only encountered Caldwell during formal occasions saw a polished executive whose success seemed completely earned. Those who worked under his authority saw something more complex, a man who measured respect through obedience and who seemed to take particular satisfaction in moments when he could demonstrate that control in front of others. The dinner party unfolding inside the mansion that evening reflected that dynamic perfectly. The guests seated around the table represented investors, attorneys, technology founders, and a few political figures who had business interests connected to Caldwell's expanding network. Conversations earlier in the night had revolved around development deals, stock market predictions, and stories of international travel. Laughter had echoed through the dining hall, while waiters moved gracefully between chairs refilling glasses and serving courses prepared by the kitchen staff. For most of the evening, Jonathan Caldwell had appeared relaxed, enjoying the admiration that often accompanied gatherings like these. But moments like the one involving Emily Carter revealed how quickly that atmosphere could change. As Caldwell focused his attention on the young maid standing before him, the power imbalance inside the room became impossible to ignore. Emily Carter held no influence among the people seated at that table. She was simply a member of the domestic staff, someone whose job required quiet efficiency rather than personal recognition. In many ways, she represented the exact type of person Caldwell was accustomed to correcting without consequence. She could not challenge him financially, socially, or professionally. If he chose to criticize her work in front of dozens of guests, there was little she could do except endure the moment and hope the evening moved on quickly. It was a situation that had likely played out in different forms many times before within the walls of that mansion. Yet what made this moment unusual was not simply Caldwell's decision to humiliate a staff member in front of his guests. It was the subtle reaction of the people watching. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Caldwell continued speaking, their earlier amusement fading into cautious silence. Others watched closely with expressions that suggested curiosity rather than discomfort, as if they were trying to understand why the maid remained so composed while being addressed so sharply. Jonathan Caldwell himself seemed to notice that calmness. He expected embarrassment or fear, perhaps even tears that would confirm his authority over the situation. Instead, Emily Carter stood quietly with the silver tray balanced in her hands, her posture controlled, her expression restrained. For someone like Caldwell, who valued dominance in every interaction, that quiet composure was unsettling. It challenged the outcome he had likely anticipated when he began criticizing her moments earlier. He was accustomed to responses that reinforced his position at the top of the room. But Emily's silence carried a different kind of message, one that suggested she was not reacting in the way he expected. Guests watching the exchange began to sense the tension building between them. Even the staff members standing near the walls noticed the change. The scene no longer felt like a routine correction delivered by a powerful host to an employee who had made a small mistake. Something about Emily Carter's calm presence had shifted the atmosphere of the entire room. Jonathan Caldwell leaned slightly closer to her, lowering his voice just enough that the guests had to listen more carefully to hear what he was saying. His tone remained firm, but there was now a hint of frustration beneath it. He repeated his accusation about the mistake she had supposedly made and asked whether she understood how unacceptable it was. Emily nodded once in acknowledgement, though she did not offer the apology Caldwell seemed to be waiting for. The tray in her hands had stopped shaking. Her shoulders remained steady as she looked briefly toward the table and then back at the floor. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable to anyone who was not paying close attention. But for Caldwell, it was another signal that the moment was not unfolding exactly as he had intended. Across the table, a few guests began exchanging quiet glances. They had attended enough corporate gatherings to recognize when tension between two people was escalating beyond what had originally been expected. Some wondered privately whether Caldwell might end the exchange soon and allow the dinner to continue. Others felt a strange curiosity about the young maid standing in front of him. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she was carrying knowledge the rest of the room did not share. Even the house manager, observing from the doorway between the dining hall and the kitchen, felt an unusual sense of anticipation. Because the truth was that Emily Carter had been quietly observing Jonathan Caldwell since the first day she arrived at the mansion. She had watched how he greeted investors with warmth while dismissing employees with barely a glance. She had listened to fragments of conversations during events like this one, collecting details that most staff members would have ignored in their effort to remain invisible. She had learned the schedules of the guests who visited frequently and the topics Caldwell seemed most cautious about discussing in public. And although none of the people seated at that table realized it yet, Emily Carter had not chosen to work in that house by accident. For Jonathan Caldwell, however, the moment still appeared simple. A maid had made a mistake during an important dinner. A correction was necessary, and the authority he had built over years of success demanded that the situation be handled publicly so everyone present would understand his expectations. But as the seconds stretched longer and the attention of the entire room remained fixed on the exchange, Caldwell felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. The calm expression on Emily Carter's face, the silent curiosity of the guests, and the strange stillness that had settled across the mansion created a sense that something unusual was unfolding. And perhaps the most important question in that moment was one that none of the guests had considered yet. Why was this particular maid standing so calmly in front of a man known for humiliating employees who crossed him? What made Emily Carter different from the dozens of other workers who had passed through the mansion over the years? As Jonathan Caldwell prepared to speak again, determined to end the situation on his own terms, the answer to that question was already moving quietly through the room in the form of the stranger who had risen from his chair moments earlier. Emily Carter was the kind of person most guests never remembered seeing, even after spending an entire evening in the same room with her. She moved quietly through Jonathan Caldwell's mansion with the careful rhythm of someone who had learned that the best way to survive in a house like that was to remain unnoticed. When the doors opened for another elegant dinner or business gathering, Emily would already be there hours earlier, helping prepare the dining hall, polishing silverware, and arranging the small details that guests would later admire without thinking about who had placed them there. By the time the first cars arrived at the front gates, she would be standing somewhere along the walls with the rest of the staff, dressed in the same simple uniform that made every maid in the house look almost identical. To the people attending Caldwell's events, she was simply part of the background, another employee responsible for making the evening run smoothly. But invisibility can be a powerful position for someone who understands how to use it. Over the months since Emily Carter had started working at the mansion, she had learned far more about Jonathan Caldwell than most of his guests ever would. She knew the exact moment each morning when he walked into the study overlooking the river to review financial reports. She knew the evenings when he preferred to host small private meetings rather than large social events. She knew which guests were welcomed warmly and which ones were greeted with a carefully measured politeness that suggested business tensions hidden behind polite smiles. These were not secrets in the traditional sense. They were simply details of daily life inside the house. Yet when observed over time, those details began to form patterns that told a much larger story. Emily also understood something that many people around Caldwell preferred not to acknowledge openly. Powerful men rarely reached the level of influence Jonathan Caldwell had achieved without creating enemies along the way. His companies had acquired properties and businesses that other investors had wanted for themselves. His deals had redirected millions of dollars through markets where rival firms competed fiercely for control. Even among the people seated at his dinner table on nights like this one, there were individuals whose relationships with Caldwell were built as much on cautious cooperation as on friendship. Emily heard fragments of those tensions during conversations she was never meant to notice. A raised voice in the study during a private meeting, a frustrated phone call taken in the hallway late at night, a quiet remark between two visiting executives who assumed the maid pouring their wine could not possibly be paying attention. Over time, Emily Carter collected these moments the way some people collect photographs, storing them quietly in her memory without ever discussing them with anyone else. She understood which topics made Caldwell impatient, which business partners he trusted, and which ones he watched carefully for signs of betrayal. She noticed the subtle changes in his behavior when certain names were mentioned during dinner conversations. She even observed the way some guests lowered their voices when discussing deals connected to Caldwell's investment firm, as if the walls of the mansion themselves might carry their words back to him. None of these observations were written down. Emily never kept notes or asked questions. She simply listened and watched with the calm focus of someone who had arrived at the house for a reason that went far beyond the duties listed on her employment paperwork. The other members of the staff knew Emily only as a quiet coworker who did her job well and rarely complained. She arrived on time, finished her tasks without drawing attention, and left at the end of her shifts without lingering for unnecessary conversation. In a house where employees sometimes rotated in and out depending on the season or the schedule of events, Emily's consistency made her reliable in the eyes of the house manager. That reliability allowed her to move freely through many parts of the mansion as she worked. She served meals in the dining hall, helped prepare guest rooms, and occasionally assisted with organizing the study before Caldwell returned from meetings in the city. To anyone observing her routine from the outside, Emily Carter appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a hard-working young woman grateful for steady employment in a household that paid its staff better than most. Yet there were small details about Emily that stood out to those who paid very close attention. Her posture remained steady even during tense moments when Caldwell criticized an employee. Her responses were always polite, but they carried a quiet confidence that suggested she was not easily intimidated. And perhaps most noticeable of all was the way she observed the world around her with calm patience rather than nervous urgency. While some new staff members rushed through tasks in fear of making mistakes, Emily worked carefully and deliberately, as though she had already accepted the pressures of the environment and chosen to navigate them on her own terms. Jonathan Caldwell himself had noticed her only occasionally before the dinner party now unfolding in his mansion. To him, she was simply another employee among many, someone whose presence mattered only when something disrupted the smooth operation of an event. The fact that she had remained largely invisible to him during her months in the house was exactly what Emily had expected when she first arrived. In a place where attention often brought trouble, remaining unnoticed could be a form of protection. But the deeper truth was that Emily Carter had not chosen Jonathan Caldwell's mansion randomly while searching for work. Long before she stepped through the front gates wearing the uniform of a housemaid, she had spent weeks researching the estate and the man who owned it. She had studied the staffing agencies that supplied employees to wealthy households in the region and quietly positioned herself to be recommended when Caldwell's house manager requested additional help. By the time she attended her interview, she already understood the general layout of the property and the types of events that took place there. She had entered the mansion prepared to observe everything. The reason for that preparation remained known only to her. Even the house manager who hired her believed Emily's story was simple: a young woman who had grown up in a modest town and was looking for steady work in a large private estate. Emily spoke politely about wanting to save money and gain experience in hospitality, the kind of explanation that satisfied most employers who rarely had time to question the personal histories of their staff. Once the paperwork was completed and she began working regular shifts, no one inside the mansion had reason to doubt the identity she presented. Yet the longer Emily remained in Caldwell's house, the more she realized how much information moved quietly through its rooms. Business discussions between investors revealed future development plans. Private conversations hinted at deals that could affect entire neighborhoods and cities far away from the riverfront estate. Occasionally, she even heard fragments of arguments between Caldwell and people whose voices carried the tension of long-standing disputes. Each piece of information seemed small on its own, but together they painted a portrait of a powerful businessman whose decisions shaped the lives of people far beyond the circle of guests who admired him during dinner parties. As the months passed, Emily continued her routine without attracting attention. She worked diligently, maintained the calm demeanor that allowed her to blend into the background, and watched as Jonathan Caldwell hosted gathering after gathering in the dining hall beneath the grand chandelier. Some evenings passed quietly, filled only with polite conversation and laughter from wealthy guests enjoying the luxury of the mansion. Other nights carried a sharper energy, especially when Caldwell entertained individuals connected to complicated negotiations or competitive business arrangements. Through it all, Emily Carter remained the same quiet figure moving between tables with a tray in her hands. And yet there was always one question lingering quietly beneath the surface of her presence in that house. Why had Emily Carter chosen this particular mansion to work in? Why had she positioned herself so carefully to gain access to the daily life of Jonathan Caldwell? The answer to that question was not something the guests seated around the dining table that evening could possibly imagine. As they watched the confrontation between Caldwell and the young maid unfold, they saw only the surface of a situation that seemed ordinary within the hierarchy of a wealthy household. What they could not yet see was the deeper story that had brought Emily Carter into that room in the first place. A story that connected her to events far beyond the walls of the mansion and to people who had been waiting patiently for the moment when Jonathan Caldwell's world would finally begin to shift. The night of the charity event had been planned for weeks, and by the time the first guests arrived at Jonathan Caldwell's mansion, every detail had already been arranged with careful precision. The long driveway leading to the estate was illuminated by rows of soft golden lights, guiding luxury cars toward the front entrance where attendants waited to open doors for arriving guests. Inside the mansion, the air carried the quiet energy of an evening designed to impress. Politicians, investors, and well-known public figures moved through the entrance hall exchanging handshakes and polite smiles, while photographers captured brief moments for social media and local news coverage. The charity itself focused on urban housing development, a cause that allowed Caldwell to present himself not only as a successful businessman, but also as someone committed to improving communities. For many of the people attending, the event was an opportunity to network with influential figures while enjoying the luxury of one of the most impressive private estates along the Hudson River. Jonathan Caldwell stood near the center of the main reception area greeting guests as they arrived. He appeared confident and relaxed, dressed in a tailored black suit that reflected the polished image he maintained during public events. Conversations flowed easily around him as he introduced investors to political representatives and spoke about the importance of the charity's mission. The guests responded warmly, raising glasses and small toasts while servers circulated with trays of wine and champagne. From the outside, the evening carried the familiar rhythm of a successful social gathering hosted by a man who understood exactly how to command attention in a room full of powerful people. Behind the scenes, however, the staff moved quickly to maintain that polished atmosphere. Emily Carter had arrived earlier that afternoon along with the rest of the service team to prepare for the event. She helped arrange glasses along the long dining table, checked the placement of silverware, and assisted the kitchen staff with organizing the courses that would be served later in the evening. By the time the reception began, she had taken her position along the wall of the dining hall, holding a tray prepared for the moment guests would be invited to sit down for dinner. Like always, she blended quietly into the background, observing the flow of the evening while carrying out her responsibilities with steady focus. As the night progressed, the atmosphere inside the mansion became louder and more relaxed. Drinks were poured freely, conversations grew more animated, and the dining hall filled with the confident voices of people accustomed to influence and wealth. Politicians discussed upcoming policies with investors who were eager to understand how those policies might affect future development projects. Celebrities attending the charity posed for photographs near the grand staircase, while business partners shared stories about recent ventures and upcoming deals. Throughout the room, the energy felt almost celebratory, as if everyone present understood that gatherings like this were not only about charity, but also about the relationships and opportunities that formed in rooms where powerful people gathered. Jonathan Caldwell seemed to enjoy the attention more than anyone else. Moving easily between groups of guests, he spoke with the ease of someone who knew that his mansion, his wealth, and his reputation had made the evening possible. Several attendees complimented him on the event, praising the organization and the elegant setting he had created for the fundraiser. Caldwell responded with modest smiles and brief remarks about the importance of generosity and leadership, though those who knew him well understood he appreciated the recognition as much as the charitable outcome. Eventually, the guests were invited to move into the large dining hall where the main dinner would take place. The room glowed under the chandelier that hung above the long, polished table, its crystal reflections shimmering across the silverware and glassware arranged with careful symmetry. Emily Carter stood along the wall with the other members of the service team, waiting for the signal from the house manager to begin serving drinks and appetizers. Conversations continued as guests found their seats, laughter echoing lightly against the high ceiling of the room. It was during one of those early moments of the dinner service that the small incident occurred. A guest seated near the middle of the table reached for a glass of wine, just as a waiter stepped beside him to refill another guest's drink. The movement caused the glass to tip slightly, and a small splash of red wine spilled across the white tablecloth. It was the kind of minor accident that happened at events like this all the time, something easily resolved with a quick apology and a fresh napkin. The waiter immediately stepped forward to clean the spill, offering polite apologies while reaching for a cloth prepared for situations exactly like this one. Most guests barely noticed the moment. A few chuckled softly, brushing it off as an ordinary mistake that would be fixed within seconds. But Jonathan Caldwell, who had been standing near the head of the table speaking with a political donor, turned his head just in time to see the small stain spreading across the tablecloth. For a brief second, his expression remained neutral as he watched the waiter move quickly to correct the situation. Then something in his demeanor shifted. Instead of allowing the staff to handle the spill quietly, Caldwell stepped closer to the table and raised his voice just enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. The conversations that had filled the room moments earlier began to slow as people realized he was addressing the incident directly. The waiter froze slightly, cloth in hand, uncertain whether to continue cleaning or step back. Emily Carter, standing a few steps away with her tray, watched the moment unfold with the same calm focus she had shown during previous gatherings. Jonathan Caldwell looked from the stain on the tablecloth to the waiter attempting to wipe it away. His tone carried the familiar edge that employees of the mansion had come to recognize over time. He asked a pointed question about how such carelessness could happen during an event meant to represent professionalism and attention to detail. The waiter tried to explain quietly, apologizing while continuing to clean the spill, but Caldwell's voice rose again before the explanation could finish. Guests began turning their heads toward the exchange. Some leaned back in their chairs with mild curiosity, while others shifted uncomfortably as they sensed the direction the moment was taking. What could have remained a minor interruption during dinner was quickly transforming into something far more public. Caldwell's posture suggested he had decided this small mistake was worth addressing in front of the entire room. Emily Carter felt the atmosphere change immediately. She had seen similar situations unfold before inside the mansion, moments when Caldwell used a minor problem as an opportunity to reinforce the authority he believed defined his role as host and employer. The spilled wine itself was not the issue anymore. It had become a stage for something else entirely. Jonathan Caldwell stepped closer to the center of the dining hall, allowing his voice to carry clearly across the table so every guest could hear him. He gestured toward the staff, asking how difficult it could possibly be to perform a simple task without creating a mess during an event attended by important people. The tone of his words was sharp but controlled, the kind that forced the employee involved to stand silently while the criticism continued. At that moment, the room that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier fell quiet. Guests who had arrived expecting an evening of charity and networking now found themselves watching a scene that felt increasingly uncomfortable. The waiter stood frozen beside the table, the cloth still in his hand, while Caldwell continued speaking in a voice that carried both authority and unmistakable disapproval. And just as the tension in the room began to settle into that familiar silence where no one wanted to intervene, Jonathan Caldwell's attention shifted. His eyes moved past the waiter, landing on another figure standing nearby with a tray balanced carefully in her hands. Emily Carter. In Caldwell's mind, the small spill had become an opportunity, not to quietly correct a mistake, but to demonstrate control in front of the powerful guests seated around him. What happened next would transform a minor accident into the moment that every person in that dining hall would remember long after the charity event ended. Jonathan Caldwell's attention settled firmly on Emily Carter as she stood only a few steps from the dining table, the silver tray balanced steadily in her hands. The waiter who had been cleaning the spilled wine stepped back slightly, unsure whether he was still the focus of Caldwell's criticism. For a brief moment, the entire room remained silent as guests followed Caldwell's gaze and realized he was now addressing someone else. Emily Carter had spent months blending into the background of events just like this one. Yet suddenly she found herself standing at the center of a room filled with politicians, investors, and influential figures who were watching closely to see what Jonathan Caldwell would do next. Caldwell motioned toward her with a small gesture of his hand, the kind of signal employees in the house had learned to obey immediately. "You," he said sharply, his voice carrying easily across the dining hall. "Come forward." Emily stepped closer without hesitation, setting the tray gently on a nearby service table before walking the final few steps toward him. The movement was simple and quiet, but it drew every eye in the room toward her. The guests who had been seated comfortably only minutes earlier now leaned back slightly in their chairs, sensing that the small incident with the spilled wine had turned into something far more uncomfortable. Jonathan Caldwell studied Emily Carter with an expression that combined irritation and calculation. Moments earlier, he had been criticizing the waiter for a simple mistake, but now his attention seemed focused on making a broader point. When powerful people host events like this, control of the room matters almost as much as the business discussions themselves. Caldwell had spent years cultivating the image of a man whose authority was unquestioned within the walls of his own home. A public correction of an employee, delivered in front of a table filled with influential guests, reinforced that image in ways he clearly understood. He began by asking Emily whether she had been responsible for supervising the service near that section of the table. The question itself was simple, but his tone suggested there was only one acceptable answer. Emily replied quietly that she had been assisting with the service, keeping her voice calm and respectful. Caldwell nodded slowly, as though confirming a suspicion he had already decided upon. He gestured toward the small stain still visible on the tablecloth where the wine had spilled moments earlier. "So this," he said, letting the word hang briefly in the air, "is the level of attention we're providing to guests tonight?" His voice was not loud enough to sound angry, but it carried the unmistakable edge of someone determined to make a point. Several guests lowered their eyes toward the table, while others watched the exchange carefully, unsure whether the situation would end quickly or continue escalating. Caldwell took another step closer to Emily Carter. "Tell me something," he continued, his tone shifting into something that sounded almost conversational. "How difficult is it to serve a glass of wine without turning a dinner into a mess?" The question drew a few uncomfortable glances among the guests. It was obvious that Emily had not been the person who spilled the wine, yet Caldwell spoke as if the responsibility somehow rested with her. Emily answered calmly that the staff always tried their best to maintain professional service. Her response was polite and measured, the kind of statement someone might give during a job review rather than a public confrontation. But Caldwell seemed unimpressed. He tilted his head slightly and gave a short, humorless smile that several guests immediately recognized as the beginning of one of his familiar performances. "Your best," he repeated slowly. "Well, that's reassuring." A few people near the far end of the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The atmosphere that had filled the room earlier with conversation and laughter had disappeared entirely, replaced by a quiet tension that made every word sound louder than it actually was. Jonathan Caldwell then asked Emily Carter another question, this time about her training. Had she worked in houses like this before? Did she understand the expectations of serving important guests? Each question carried the same underlying message, one that suggested her presence in the room was somehow inadequate for the level of people sitting at the table. The guests listened in silence as he spoke, aware that intervening would mean challenging a man whose influence extended into the business and political worlds many of them relied upon. Emily responded briefly to each question without raising her voice or changing her expression. She acknowledged the standards of the house and confirmed that she understood her responsibilities. Yet there was something about the calmness in her replies that seemed to frustrate Caldwell even more. He appeared to be waiting for a different reaction, perhaps embarrassment or visible distress that would confirm the hierarchy he was trying to demonstrate. Instead, Emily Carter stood in front of him with the same steady composure she had maintained since the moment he called her forward. Caldwell gestured toward the table once more and announced that mistakes like the spilled wine were unacceptable during an event meant to represent professionalism and generosity. Then he turned back to Emily and asked her to apologize to the guests for the disruption to the evening. The request made several people around the table glance at each other again. It was clear to everyone present that Emily had not caused the spill, yet Caldwell had positioned the situation in a way that made her responsible for correcting it publicly. For a moment, no one spoke. The guests waited to see how Emily would respond, aware that refusing the request could lead to immediate consequences for someone working in a private household like this one. Jonathan Caldwell folded his arms slightly, watching her with the expectation that she would quickly deliver the apology he had demanded. Emily Carter looked around the table slowly, meeting the eyes of a few guests who seemed almost embarrassed by the situation unfolding in front of them. Then she offered a brief apology for the interruption to the dinner service. Her voice remained calm, respectful, and steady. There was no trace of panic or desperation in her tone. The apology satisfied Caldwell just enough to continue the moment. He made another remark about the importance of competence in a house that entertained influential people, speaking as though he were offering a lesson to everyone standing along the walls in staff uniforms. A few guests forced polite smiles, hoping the situation would finally end so the evening could return to its earlier rhythm. Yet something about Emily Carter's reaction had begun to shift the mood of the room in a subtle but noticeable way. She had not cried. She had not begged for forgiveness or tried to defend herself. Instead, after offering the brief apology Caldwell demanded, she simply looked at him. Her expression was calm, almost thoughtful, as if she had been expecting this moment long before it happened. The composure in her face created a strange pause in the atmosphere of the dining hall. Jonathan Caldwell noticed it immediately. The reaction he had anticipated from a young maid standing alone in front of a room full of powerful guests had not appeared. Emily Carter was not acting like someone who felt powerless in that moment. She stood there quietly, meeting his gaze without fear, her posture steady beneath the light of the chandelier above them. Around the table, a few guests leaned slightly forward, sensing that the exchange between Caldwell and the maid was no longer following the pattern everyone expected. And in that growing silence, a question began forming in the minds of several people watching the scene unfold. Why wasn't Emily Carter afraid? For several long seconds after Emily Carter finished speaking, the room remained wrapped in a heavy silence. Jonathan Caldwell stood in front of her with the confident posture he had carried throughout the evening, but something in the air had changed. The calm expression on Emily's face had unsettled the rhythm he usually controlled so easily during moments like this. Around the table, the guests remained quiet, waiting for Caldwell to dismiss her and move the evening forward. That was the outcome everyone expected. After all, this was his mansion, his event, and a room filled with people who understood how much influence he held in their professional worlds. But before Caldwell could speak again, a chair moved quietly near the back of the dining hall. The sound was subtle, yet in that tense silence it carried across the room like a signal that something unexpected had begun. Several guests turned their heads at the same time, their attention shifting away from the confrontation near the table toward the far corner of the room. A man who had been sitting among the attendees slowly stood up. At first, no one seemed certain who he was. He had arrived earlier in the evening along with the other guests, dressed in a simple dark suit that did not attract particular attention. Unlike the celebrities or political figures who had posed for photographs near the entrance, this man had spent most of the night sitting quietly, listening more than speaking. As he stepped away from his chair, a few people at the nearby tables tried to place his face among the familiar names on the guest list. No one recognized him immediately. He had not introduced himself loudly during the reception, nor had he joined the loud conversations that filled the room earlier in the night. In a gathering filled with investors and influential personalities, it was easy for someone quiet to disappear into the background. The man began walking slowly toward the center of the dining hall. His steps were steady and deliberate, his expression calm as he moved past several guests who watched him with growing curiosity. Two of the private security guards stationed near the entrance noticed the movement at the same time. They exchanged a brief glance, uncertain whether they should intervene. The man did not appear threatening. He carried no visible tension in his posture and made no aggressive gestures. Yet the simple fact that he was approaching the center of the room during such a tense moment was unusual enough to draw their attention. Jonathan Caldwell noticed the movement as well. At first, his reaction was irritation. The dinner had already been interrupted by the small incident with the spilled wine, and now someone in the back of the room seemed to be inserting himself into the situation. Caldwell turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes as he watched the stranger approach. The guests seated around the table followed the scene with quiet fascination. No one spoke. No one tried to stop the man. The entire dining hall had become a stage where every movement carried weight. Emily Carter also noticed him. She did not react with surprise the way many of the guests did. Instead, her gaze followed his approach with the same quiet composure she had shown throughout the confrontation with Caldwell. Anyone paying close attention might have noticed that her posture relaxed slightly as the stranger drew closer, though the change was subtle enough to escape most people in the room. The man stopped a few feet away from Jonathan Caldwell and Emily Carter. Up close, his presence carried a quiet authority that was difficult to explain. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with a calm expression and the kind of steady confidence that suggested he was accustomed to serious conversations. He did not raise his voice when he spoke. Instead, he addressed Caldwell in a tone that was firm but controlled. "That's enough." The words were simple, almost understated, yet they landed in the room with surprising weight. Jonathan Caldwell stared at him for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether he had heard correctly. In his own home, during an event he had organized for his own guests, someone had just stepped forward and told him to stop. It was not something Caldwell was accustomed to hearing. The guests around the table shifted slightly in their chairs. Some leaned forward with interest, sensing that the evening had just taken an unexpected turn. Others glanced toward the security guards near the entrance, waiting to see whether they would intervene. The guards remained still, watching carefully as the exchange unfolded. Caldwell straightened his posture and studied the man standing in front of him. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, his voice carrying a controlled edge. "Do I know you?" The stranger did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked briefly at Emily Carter, then back at Caldwell. There was no hesitation in his expression. "You don't recognize me," the man replied calmly. "But you should." A quiet ripple of curiosity moved through the guests seated around the table. Several people exchanged confused glances, trying again to identify the stranger who had suddenly interrupted the host of the evening. Jonathan Caldwell himself seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. The confidence that had defined his posture only moments earlier began to shift into something more cautious. "Who exactly are you?" Caldwell asked. The man took a slow breath before answering. When he finally spoke again, his voice remained calm, but the words carried a certainty that immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. "My name is Daniel Hayes." For most of the guests, the name meant nothing at first. But for Jonathan Caldwell, the reaction was immediate. His expression tightened slightly, and for the first time since the evening began, the certainty in his eyes faded. Several people at the table noticed the change instantly. Daniel Hayes watched him carefully, as if waiting for the recognition to settle. When it did, Caldwell's confidence cracked in a way that had not happened all night. The man who had spent the evening commanding attention in front of powerful guests suddenly looked less certain of the ground beneath him. A quiet murmur spread across the room as a few guests began whispering to each other, repeating the name Daniel Hayes in confused tones. The security guards near the entrance shifted their stance slightly, still unsure whether this was a situation requiring their involvement. Jonathan Caldwell's voice returned, but it carried a faint tension that had not been there before. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Daniel Hayes met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here," he said slowly, "because you chose the wrong person to humiliate tonight." The sentence hung in the air like a warning. Around the table, the guests realized that something far more serious than an awkward dinner moment was unfolding. For the first time since the confrontation began, Jonathan Caldwell looked genuinely unsettled. And in that growing silence, a question began spreading quietly through the room and through the minds of everyone watching. Who was Daniel Hayes? The dining hall remained completely silent after Daniel Hayes spoke. Jonathan Caldwell stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the man who had just stepped forward and challenged him in front of his own guests. Only minutes earlier, Caldwell had controlled the room with the confidence of someone who believed nothing inside his mansion could threaten his authority. Now that confidence had begun to fade, replaced by a cautious tension that several people around the table immediately noticed. The name Daniel Hayes had clearly meant something to him, even if most of the other guests were still trying to understand why. Several quiet whispers moved across the table as investors and political figures leaned slightly toward one another, repeating the name in hushed voices. Some searched their memory for where they might have heard it before. Others simply watched the exchange with growing curiosity, sensing that the situation unfolding in front of them was no longer a simple moment of embarrassment for a house employee. Emily Carter remained standing calmly between the two men, her posture unchanged, her expression steady beneath the soft light of the chandelier. Jonathan Caldwell cleared his throat and tried to recover the confident tone he had used earlier in the evening. "If you're trying to make some kind of scene," he said carefully, "this isn't the place for it." The remark sounded firm, but it lacked the sharp authority that had filled his voice only minutes earlier. Daniel Hayes did not react to the warning. Instead, he took another small step forward, positioning himself beside Emily Carter. The movement alone sent another ripple of whispers through the guests. It was becoming increasingly clear that the stranger had not approached the center of the room by accident. He was there for a reason. "You're right about one thing," Daniel Hayes replied calmly. "This isn't the place for a scene." His gaze moved briefly across the table, acknowledging the presence of the powerful figures seated there. "But it is the place for the truth." Jonathan Caldwell's expression hardened slightly. "What truth?" Daniel Hayes turned toward Emily Carter for a moment before speaking again, as if confirming something silently between them. Then he faced Caldwell once more. "The truth," he said slowly, "is that the woman you've been humiliating tonight is not who you think she is." A low murmur passed through the room. Several guests shifted forward in their chairs, suddenly far more interested in the conversation than they had been moments earlier. Jonathan Caldwell frowned. "She's a member of my staff," he replied sharply. "That's exactly who she is." Daniel Hayes shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "That's who you believed she was." The words settled into the room with a weight that made the silence feel heavier than before. Caldwell glanced briefly at Emily Carter, studying her face as though he were seeing her for the first time. For months, she had existed in his house as one of many employees whose names he barely remembered. Now a stranger was standing beside her claiming there was something far more important about her identity. "What are you talking about?" Caldwell demanded. Daniel Hayes answered without raising his voice. "I know Emily Carter," he said, "and I didn't meet her in this house." The statement immediately triggered another wave of whispers among the guests. A few people exchanged puzzled looks, while others leaned closer together, trying to understand the significance of what had just been said. Jonathan Caldwell looked from Daniel Hayes to Emily Carter again, his irritation beginning to shift into something more uncertain. "If you're implying something," he said carefully, "you'd better explain it." Daniel Hayes nodded slightly, as if expecting that response. "You see, Jonathan," he continued, speaking Caldwell's first name with a calm familiarity that felt strangely deliberate. "Emily Carter didn't come into your life by accident. She didn't apply to work here because she needed a job." For the first time since the confrontation began, several guests noticed a small change in Caldwell's posture. The tension in his shoulders became more visible as he listened. Daniel Hayes continued. "Emily Carter has spent months inside this house, watching, listening, learning how everything here works." The whispers around the table grew louder now. A few people began glancing at Emily with entirely new expressions, trying to understand how the quiet maid who had served their drinks earlier in the evening could suddenly be connected to something larger. Jonathan Caldwell let out a short laugh, though it sounded forced. "You're suggesting she's what?" "A spy," he said with thin sarcasm. Daniel Hayes did not smile. "In a way," he replied. The word landed harder than anyone expected. Caldwell's expression tightened immediately. He looked at Emily Carter again, searching her face for some sign that the stranger's words were absurd. But Emily remained calm, her gaze steady, offering neither confirmation nor denial. "Enough of this," Caldwell said sharply. "Whatever game you think you're playing." "It's not a game," Daniel Hayes interrupted quietly. The interruption alone stunned several guests. Very few people ever cut Jonathan Caldwell off in the middle of a sentence, especially not inside his own home. Daniel Hayes took another slow breath before continuing. "You've spent years building your reputation, Jonathan," he said. "Powerful investments, strategic acquisitions, deals that changed entire neighborhoods." Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "What does that have to do with this?" Daniel Hayes answered with a calm certainty that caused several guests to stop whispering and listen more closely. "Because Emily Carter knows about some of those deals." The words seemed to settle over the table like a shadow. For the first time that evening, Jonathan Caldwell looked genuinely unsettled. A few investors seated near the far end of the table exchanged concerned glances. Others leaned closer, sensing that the conversation had moved into territory far beyond an awkward dinner confrontation. Daniel Hayes continued speaking slowly, allowing every word to carry its full meaning. "You thought she was invisible," he said. "You thought she was just another employee walking quietly through the halls of this mansion. But Emily Carter has been paying attention to everything." Jonathan Caldwell's confidence continued to slip. He glanced around the table briefly, aware that dozens of influential people were now watching him in a way they had not before. The balance of power in the room had shifted in a subtle but unmistakable way. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" he asked, his voice tighter than before. Daniel Hayes looked directly at him. "I'm not accusing you of anything tonight," he replied calmly. Then he placed a gentle hand on Emily Carter's shoulder. "I'm just reminding you," he said, "that the woman you tried to humiliate in front of all these guests is someone you should have been far more careful with." The dining hall fell silent again. Jonathan Caldwell stared at Emily Carter with an expression that now carried something very different from the authority he had displayed earlier. It was realization. Because in that moment, he understood something terrible. He had made a mistake. A very big mistake. For several seconds after Daniel Hayes finished speaking, the entire dining hall seemed suspended in a quiet tension that no one present had expected when the evening began. Jonathan Caldwell stood motionless, his attention fixed on Emily Carter, as if trying to understand how the quiet maid who had moved unnoticed through his mansion for months could suddenly be connected to something that made a stranger confront him in front of powerful guests. Around the table, conversations had completely stopped. Politicians, investors, and celebrities who had arrived expecting an elegant charity dinner were now witnessing a moment that felt far more serious than an awkward interruption to the evening. Jonathan Caldwell's mind moved quickly, searching through years of business deals, rivalries, and conflicts. A man who had built an empire through aggressive negotiations and strategic acquisitions inevitably left behind people who felt wronged by his decisions. Yet the presence of Daniel Hayes suggested that this situation was tied to something more specific. Caldwell recognized the name, even if many of the guests around the table did not. That recognition was not comfortable. Daniel Hayes noticed the shift in Caldwell's expression. The calm certainty in Hayes' posture suggested that he understood exactly what Caldwell was remembering. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence itself seemed to confirm that the confrontation was connected to events far older than the dinner party unfolding in the mansion. And slowly, as Caldwell's thoughts moved backward through time, the memory surfaced. Several years earlier, long before Emily Carter ever stepped through the gates of his estate, Jonathan Caldwell had been involved in one of the most aggressive acquisitions of his career. At the time, he had been expanding his investment firm rapidly, searching for opportunities to purchase struggling companies and reshape them into profitable ventures. The strategy had earned him enormous success, but it had also drawn criticism from those who believed his methods sometimes pushed ethical boundaries. One of those acquisitions involved a technology development company based in Chicago. The company had been small but innovative, specializing in urban infrastructure software designed to help cities manage transportation and housing development more efficiently. Investors believed the company's technology could eventually transform how large cities handled growth and planning. But the business had also been vulnerable. Financial pressure, a complicated ownership structure, and disagreements among its founding partners had left the company exposed to outside investors looking for control. When Jonathan Caldwell's firm began purchasing shares through a series of aggressive investment moves, the leadership of the company quickly realized they were facing a takeover they could not easily stop. Within months, Caldwell's firm had gained enough influence to restructure the company's leadership and redirect its strategy. To the financial press, it looked like another example of Caldwell's business instincts at work. Analysts praised the move as a bold decision that positioned his investment group to dominate a growing sector of urban technology. But inside the company itself, the story felt very different. Several of the original employees lost their positions during the restructuring. Entire departments were dissolved as Caldwell's firm redirected the company toward projects that aligned with his broader investment strategy. What had once been a small but ambitious team of developers and engineers quickly transformed into a division controlled by executives appointed by Caldwell's organization. The company's original founder fought the takeover for months. He argued publicly that the acquisition had destroyed the vision the company was built upon. In interviews, he accused Caldwell's firm of exploiting internal financial weaknesses to seize control of technology that had taken years to develop. Those protests did not change the outcome. Within a year, the company had been completely absorbed into Caldwell's growing business empire. The founder eventually stepped away from the industry entirely after exhausting his legal options. To the outside world, the controversy faded quickly, replaced by the next business headline involving Caldwell's expanding influence. But the people who had lost their careers during that takeover did not forget what happened. And one of those people had been Daniel Hayes. Hayes had not been the public face of the company at the time. He was not the founder who gave interviews to reporters or the executive who argued with Caldwell's lawyers during negotiations. Instead, Daniel Hayes had been one of the senior engineers responsible for designing the company's most important software systems. He had spent nearly a decade helping build the technology that investors believed could reshape urban infrastructure management across the country. When Caldwell's firm acquired the company and reorganized its leadership, Hayes was among the employees who were dismissed during the transition. The official explanation cited restructuring and strategic realignment. But for Hayes, the experience represented something far deeper than the loss of a job. The work he had spent years building had been taken away. The company he believed in had been dismantled, and the people responsible for that outcome had walked away wealthier than before. The memory of those events had stayed with him long after the headlines disappeared. Back in the present, inside the quiet dining hall of Jonathan Caldwell's mansion, Daniel Hayes watched the recognition slowly settle across Caldwell's face. The billionaire had clearly connected the name to the past he had once considered simply another business victory. Several guests at the table noticed the change in Caldwell immediately. The confident host who had mocked Emily Carter only minutes earlier now looked far less certain of the situation unfolding around him. "What does any of that have to do with tonight?" Caldwell asked carefully, though his voice no longer carried the same authority it once had. Daniel Hayes answered calmly. "Because the past has a way of returning," he said. Then he glanced toward Emily Carter again. "And sometimes it returns in ways people never expect." The guests followed his gaze toward the young woman who had stood quietly in Caldwell's mansion for months without attracting attention. A few people around the table began whispering again, their curiosity growing as the pieces of the story slowly started to connect. Jonathan Caldwell looked at Emily Carter more closely now, studying her face as if trying to find some link between her and the events Daniel Hayes had just described. "Who are you?" he asked, the question sounding less like a challenge and more like genuine uncertainty. Emily Carter did not answer immediately. For the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed a small pause to settle over the room before speaking. "When I came here," she said quietly, "it wasn't for the job." Another wave of murmurs moved through the guests. Daniel Hayes nodded slightly, as though confirming something everyone in the room was only beginning to understand. Emily Carter continued. "I came here because of what happened years ago," she said. Jonathan Caldwell felt the weight of those words immediately, because in that moment, the truth began to form clearly in his mind. Emily Carter had never been supposed to work in his house. She had come there for another reason entirely. Jonathan Caldwell's eyes narrowed as the room seemed to shrink around him. Every whisper, every sideways glance from the guests suddenly felt louder than it had moments before. Emily Carter remained calm, standing just a few feet from him, yet the weight of her presence carried a revelation no one else could ignore. Daniel Hayes stepped closer, his tone even, deliberate, carrying authority that contrasted sharply with Caldwell's faltering confidence. "It's time the truth came out," Hayes said, and the room immediately sensed that what followed would change everything. Emily Carter took a steady breath and finally spoke, her voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I wasn't hired just to serve your guests tonight. I've been working alongside Daniel Hayes for months, monitoring your operations, your patterns, and your dealings. What you see as loyalty and silence was preparation for accountability." The words landed heavily in the room. Guests exchanged shocked glances. Politicians, investors, and celebrities shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing this was no ordinary confrontation. They were witnessing the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan. Jonathan Caldwell's jaw tightened. "You've been spying on me?" His voice carried disbelief, tinged with anger, though it lacked the commanding authority he had displayed earlier. Daniel Hayes shook his head slowly. "Not spying, Jonathan. Observing. You see, the decisions you made years ago destroyed lives. Some of those affected were silent, but not forgotten. And we've been waiting for the moment you would reveal your true nature. The arrogance, the entitlement, the willingness to humiliate someone simply because you could." Caldwell looked at Emily Carter again, seeing her not as a maid, but as a strategist he had underestimated completely. The calm in her expression was deliberate, unshakable, and in that realization, Caldwell felt something unfamiliar, unease. "And you?" he asked, eyes flicking to Hayes. "You just waited?" "Yes," Daniel Hayes replied, voice unwavering. "I waited to ensure the truth was undeniable, that the man who prides himself on control would finally encounter someone he could not manipulate, that you would face accountability in front of witnesses who mattered." Emily Carter's eyes met Caldwell's. "Tonight isn't about punishment. It's about showing you that power has limits and arrogance has consequences. Everything you thought you controlled, the house, the guests, even the narrative, you did not." The guests leaned in, some whispering, some wide-eyed, as the story unfolded before them. The room felt charged with revelation. The powerful host who had humiliated her just moments ago now stood exposed in a way no business deal or calculated charm could cover. Caldwell's previous dominance had evaporated under the calm precision of Hayes and Carter's carefully coordinated reveal. Daniel Hayes took a measured step back, allowing the tension to settle. "We've been watching for months," he said. "Not because of anger, but because accountability is necessary when someone has misused power so freely." Caldwell's gaze flicked from Hayes to Emily Carter, then across the room to the silent, astonished guests. For the first time, the billionaire realized that tonight, his reputation, his control, and his sense of authority were not enough to protect him. And in that realization, the first cracks of humility began to appear. The room remained tense, the silence deep, as Emily Carter added quietly, "Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos." And in that brief, deliberate statement, the stage was set for the final unmasking of truths that had remained hidden for years. Jonathan Caldwell had been confronted by the consequences of his own actions, and for the first time, he understood that power alone could no longer shield him from exposure. Jonathan Caldwell stood at the center of the grand dining hall, the weight of silence pressing down harder than any applause or murmured approval could have. The guests, once eager to be near him, now shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that carried a mixture of disbelief and judgment. Politicians, investors, and socialites who had filled the room with laughter and admiration just hours before now quietly rose from their seats, gathering their coats, their whispered conversations signaling a collective withdrawal of support. Every step they took toward the exits felt like a small fracture widening in the empire of influence Caldwell had built over decades. The confidence that had defined him for years faltered, replaced by a creeping awareness that charm and power alone were no longer enough to shield him. Emily Carter stood at the periphery, calm and composed, her posture unyielding despite the tension surrounding her. She had endured humiliation and scrutiny, yet never wavered, never raised her voice, never begged for mercy. The dignity with which she carried herself now contrasted sharply with Caldwell's faltering authority, and it was clear to everyone watching that the woman who had been underestimated for months had emerged unshakable. Slowly, she turned and began to walk toward the exit, her movements measured, deliberate, and undeniably powerful. Every guest who saw her leave understood that her presence commanded respect, not because of wealth or status, but because of courage and principle. Daniel Hayes, having orchestrated the exposure with precise control, stepped back into the shadows of the hall. He did not linger, nor did he announce his departure. He simply moved quietly, leaving no trace of fanfare, but every step he took reinforced the message that he had been the catalyst of the evening's reckoning. Caldwell's empire, his aura of invincibility, had been challenged not by force, but by strategic observation, moral authority, and patience. Hayes' disappearance, like his entrance, was understated yet impactful, a reminder that justice could arrive quietly but decisively. Jonathan Caldwell's gaze followed Emily Carter as she disappeared through the main doors of the mansion, the reality settling fully upon him for the first time. The millionaire who had once ruled every conversation, every glance, and every action within this space now stood alone, confronted by the consequences of his behavior. The whispers of the departing guests lingered, echoing the truth Caldwell could no longer ignore. Power had limits, and accountability had arrived. In the months to come, stories of the night's events would circulate, reputations would be reassessed, and the lesson of the evening would remain undeniable. Emily Carter had walked away with more than safety. She had claimed autonomy, respect, and a moral victory that no wealth could undo. Daniel Hayes had ensured that the balance of justice, long delayed, was finally observed. And Jonathan Caldwell, left amidst the echoes of a once dominant presence, now faced a reality he could not control or rewrite. The final realization hung heavy in the air. Influence, charisma, and wealth could intimidate many, but integrity, courage, and quiet intelligence could confront even the most powerful and prevail. Jonathan Caldwell had learned, too late, that the house he controlled, the guests he dazzled, and the authority he wielded could not protect him from the consequences of his own choices. The mansion, once filled with pomp, prestige, and laughter, now carried the silence of reckoning. And Emily Carter, walking into the night with her head held high, embodied the truth that some victories, though unseen at first, resonate far longer and stronger than the fleeting power of those who underestimate them. Justice had been served. Jonathan Caldwell was left alone, humbled. The maid had walked away unbroken, and the stranger, Daniel Hayes, had disappeared quietly, leaving behind only the undeniable mark of accountability. Voiceover. A man's wealth can command a room, but his character is what decides whether anyone stays. Throughout the evening, from the first moment Jonathan Caldwell humiliated Emily Carter to the quiet intervention of Daniel Hayes, the story had unfolded with careful tension. Every glance, every whispered exchange, every calculated pause had built layers of suspense that drew the guests, and now the audience, into the consequences of unchecked power. Emily's courage, calm composure, and quiet intelligence provided an emotional anchor that kept viewers invested in her journey, while Caldwell's arrogance and need for control created a villain whose downfall felt both inevitable and satisfying. Daniel Hayes' patient orchestration added intrigue, slowly revealing his identity and connection to the past, keeping curiosity alive at every turn. The moral clarity of the ending, where justice was served without violence, ensured that the story resonated deeply with viewers, leaving a lasting impression. True authority is measured not by influence or wealth, but by respect, empathy, and integrity, qualities that cannot be bought, only earned.